is my great pleasure to welcome you today. My name is John Swenson-Wright. I'm the head of the Asia program here at Chatham House. Our speaker today needs really no introduction, but just let me say a few words. Anwar Ibrahim is the leader of the opposition party in Malaysia, a figure of great historical and political significance. He served as Deputy Prime Minister in Malaysia between 1993 and 1998, and coterminously also served as Finance Minister. His record at that time was seen as particularly instrumental in dealing with the Asian financial crisis. He is clearly a very influential and public figure, often talking importantly about the significance of building bridges between the West and the East. His party secured 52% of the vote in the 2013 elections and holds 40% of the seats in the National Parliament. He is a political survivor, having been imprisoned for a period of 6 years in solitary confinement. He faces the prospect of being returned to prison, pending a judgment by the appeals court in Malaysia. And therefore, his presence here today is particularly important in his ability to comment on the political situation in his own country, and of course, his own unique political biography. But without further ado.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah, and a very good afternoon, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen. And thank you to Chatham House for this wonderful opportunity. And I understand you were given very short notice and boost my ego a little to consider the option whether to stay here in London or go back to prison in Malaysia. But I've decided to return to the struggle, certainly not necessarily to prison. When one mentions Asia, the refrain freedom and democracy doesn't naturally come to mind. It is true that Asia does have the world's two largest democracies. There's India, which in sheer numbers dwarfs the entire European and American democracies put together. And we have also Indonesia, touted as the world's largest Muslim democracy. But we know that the test of democracy is not in quantity, but in quality. And while we're in the numbers game, let us not forget that Asia also has the world's largest non-democracy. The dragon has awakened. It is now the fastest growing and soon to be the largest economy in the world. In his poem, The Statues, William Butler Yeats was concerned with more than just calculations and numbers when he wrote about all Asiatic vague immensities. He appreciated the importance of the cultural and civilizational aspects of what we call soft power. For in terms of size, there's still the trinity of the Orient, namely Japan, South Korea, John is an expert, and Taiwan. They are quality democracies, and they seem established enough to remain so. They have vibrant civil societies, some like Japan's Sasakawa Peace Foundation, actively promoting freedom and democracy across the region. But as nations, they seem to adopt a policy of political abstinence, eschewing any aspirations of being drivers of democracy for the rest of Asia. The fact remains that autocratic regimes still litter the geopolitical landscape in Asia. They may be absolute monarchies or dictatorship from dynastic line or autocracies that have monopolized power for years. They may also be so-called emerging economies with veneer of all the trappings of democracy, but which in truth are mere sham democracies governed by political elites bent on retaining power. A classic statement on democracy, almost a cliche, is attributed to Winston Churchill, which I think is worth repeating. Many forms of government have been tried and will be tried in this world of sin and woe. No one pretends that democracy is perfect. Indeed, it has been said that democracy is the worst form of government except all those other forms that have been tried from time to time. As for the so-called Asian century, there is no consensus on what the criteria are. Many would agree that impressive growth for the last 3 decades should count as a major indicator. In spite of the 1997 Asian financial crisis, Asia's economic performance has been on the ascent, and if it continues for another 2 decades, may well become a force that could bring about a power shift. And this seems to be sufficient precedent for establishing the Asian century. But when it comes to soft power, the jury is still out. For 3 decades, China had many opportunities to take a lead role in geopolitical affairs, but it did not measure up to the challenge. Its priority has always remained economic growth. Who is to say that this is a right or a wrong move? But in terms of its potential to garner soft power, this is an underachievement. Nevertheless, some say that China is incapacitated from leading even Asia in geopolitical matters because of foundational issues of governance. In spite of a more open market and FDI growing by leaps and bounds, there should be no mistaking that it remains the world's largest and most powerful autocracy. Well, Putin may dispute that, but doesn't change China's track record as far as human rights and other fundamental liberties are concerned. In the context of our discussion today on the Asian century, this is indeed an intractable problem. As well as economic power, China may also be able to deliver on culture as one aspect of soft power, but I doubt that will be enough to cloak China with moral authority. So what about India? Given its track record in the political arena, India, with a vibrant democracy, seems a more obvious choice. Rule of law, independence of the judiciary, separation of powers, free and fair elections. These are all the plus points for China. For India, of course, the major challenge for Modi, of course, the peace, the concern of ethnic minorities, Muslims, Christians, and the Dalits. And India's economic infrastructure is still weak. And just like China, it tends to be very protectionist. Having said that, a small caveat is in order. In the Western media, when it comes to Asia, it is called increasing protectionism. But when it's the USA or Europe, similar measures are called economic patriotism. The great Chinese sage Confucius, or Master Kung, was absolutely spot on in advocating the rectification of names. The proper designation of things ensures social harmony, not just in domestic affairs, but in international relations as well. While Asian countries can look at India respectfully for its economic performance, the greater focus should be on its democratic values and the principles of pluralism and inclusiveness. As Amartya Sen has pointed out, India has a glaring contradiction. The continuing, grinding poverty of its masses contrasts sharply with its alleged economic success. It was a poor economy coupled, of course, with the recurrent corruption scandals that propelled the BJP to such a grand victory in the elections. And mind you, this is 38% of popular votes compared to our 52. And I remain Your Majesty's leader of the opposition. Nevertheless, with the increasing gap between the rich and the poor, the growing demands for social justice, India's prospect of being emulated by others will be dim until some major progress is made in this area. To talk of democracy divorced from social context would be pointless. We have seen Occupy Wall Street movement that spread around the world. It is an example of cracking social cohesion and stability in established democracies when wealth and economic opportunities are monopolized by the rich and powerful. The signs are already there in various parts of Asia. In another decade, one can imagine how much deeper and wider this gap will be unless some major redistribution, affirmative action is made to assure social justice. It is true that issues such as about evolution of inequality and wealth concentration in the hands of a few are easier asked than answered. In his Capital in the 21st century, Thomas Piketty shows that modern economic growth and the diffusion of knowledge may not have led to inequalities of the scale warned by Karl Marx. But the main driver of inequality is unbridled free market economics. This tends to generate returns on capital that exceed the rate of economic growth. And today, this threatens to generate extreme inequalities that stir discontent and undermine democratic values. Aside from the threat posed by the extreme inequalities, I believe the problem of governance is still and remain the greatest impediment as Asian nations get richer and the reins of power continue to be concentrated in the hands of the upper echelons. Though there is no correlation between corruption and geography, the scourge of corruption happens to be the most rampant in Asia, Latin America, and Africa. China and India have been hit by high-profile corruption cases, and many argue that one of the biggest factors that brought down the Indian National Congress Party was corruption. Southeast Asia, needless to say, is riddled with corruption. This is an area Indonesia also must seriously examine. However, unlike its neighbors, refrain from mentioning a few, Indonesia has taken many strides towards full democracy. Complaints of such localized incidents of vote buying notwithstanding, elections in Indonesia are by far superior to others in the region in terms of being fair and free. I always have a slight caveat joke to former Vice President Al Gore. The elections in 1955 in Indonesia is deemed to be more free than Florida in the year 2000. As for Turkey, I believe that politically the system is in place with the institutionalization of democracy, the rule of law, of poor governance. Don't ask me about Twitter and YouTube. We'll come to that. But economically, its growth trajectories are far better than its European counterparts, and in certain respects are as impressive as that of the Asian tigers and dragons. And with an increasingly more sophisticated middle class, its potential in this regard cannot be underestimated. It is true that recent events appear to have cast a negative light on the state of its democracy. But Turkey is facing exceptional circumstances caused in no small part by elements hostile or to destabilize and bringing back what we consider as authoritarian military regime. Egypt, unfortunately, is a different story. In the aftermath of the 3rd July 2013 military coup, which toppled the democratically elected government of President Morsi, and the missteps in Libya and Bahrain, many have cynically dismissed the Arab Spring as the Arab Winter. Now that the illegitimate government of Field Marshal al-Sisi is going into overdrive to legitimize itself with the latest sham elections, all eyes are on the United States and Europe, EU in particular. How will they respond to this phase, what is essentially a protracted military coup? Will America and the EU repeat the errors they made for decades with Mubarak? This is a question begging for answer. Speaking of military coups, let us not leave out Thailand, which has fashionably slouched back to its old habits. But as a firm believer in freedom and democracy, and whatever circumstances, the military has no business to be in government. Tunisia, on the other hand, has managed to come out of the storm, walking tall as a new nation liberated from decades of virtual dictatorship. But the Arab Spring not only brought down oppressive regimes, it shattered the misconceptions about Islam and democracy. Turkey and Indonesia, I maintain, had already settled this issue. Nevertheless, the Arab states were always seen as the exception. So the case of Tunisia should put the matter to rest. It has crossed its first major hurdle with the ratification of the new constitution in January 2014, and we await the general elections due by the end of 2014. Now, if an Asian century draws nigh, a power shift from the west to the east would appear to be on the horizon. But these are suppositions conditioned by many eventualities. To be worthy of the name, such a century should be more about exercising the fruits of growing economic power. It has to mean more than them or us calculations. Calculations driven by insistence on false dichotomy between West and East. An Asian century should be built on solid, sustainable foundations of enhancing civil society, delivering good governance, and increasingly liberties and freedoms to the people of Asia, along with rising living standards. If it becomes a zero-sum game of they win, therefore we lose, everyone is the poorer. Invest in and support the quality and forget the width. Therein lies our best hope. Thank you. Terima kasih.